Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Hypertrophy Past and Present. Thank you for joining us as always. Chris, how are you doing today?
I'm doing very well, thanks, Jake.
Good to hear. So we introduced golden era plans last week, and I've had some interesting feedback from people. A few people were actually shocked at how different the plans were, which I don't know why they were so shocked, because we still see plans like that today quite commonly online. But I guess it is interesting to see that stark contrast, especially when it's a workout that's performed by the same person just over, sort of pre-enhancement and post-enhancement. So that was the first time we've compared those. So if you missed last week's episode, go back and have a look, and you can see an early example of how routines changed in the early anabolics period. Now, we will be introducing more plans like that, but I wanted to jump back to a silver era plan this week. And we're jumping back to Clancy Ross, who we have discussed in the past. So Mr. America, Mr. Universe winner. Now, Clancy, we introduced Clancy early on because he actually did some interesting things. He was one of the first bodybuilders to use a split routine, like an upper lower. So what he would do is he actually use his full body and he split it into upper lower in the same day. Now, he didn't do that all the time. He did that before competition, and he did some interesting things before competition. We're going to talk about another interesting type of routine he did today before competitions. But he's an interesting character because he started when single sets were kind of the only way of doing things. And so he actually bridged that period of starting out just doing single sets and then experimenting with multi-sets. And then he actually became a huge proponent of the multi-set system, which was usually only like 2 or 3 sets per exercise. It wasn't anything like what we see today. But he actually, won some of his competitions using a single set system, won some of his competitions using 2 or 3 sets per exercise. And it's, again, just interesting to see that development there of the same lifter and how they responded to slightly different routines and tweaking their routine over time. So the routine we're going to talk about today, I'll be honest, there's a lot that I love about the silver era, obviously, and we talk about that each week. And then there's some things I look at, and I made this comment a while ago, that sometimes I see stuff that they were doing, and at the time I think to myself, why? Like, why? What were they thinking? I don't get it. And sometimes over time, it dawned to me, oh, that's why they did that. And I'll be honest, this is one of those things that hasn't dawned on me yet, and I still don't understand why they did this. There's a little bit that I will discuss as to, maybe why, but I still don't really understand the full rationale behind it. So it is something that I've sort of held off on presenting to you guys, but I figure it's relevant to what we're talking about today. So let's jump in and give you guys perhaps an example of something that I think maybe I wouldn't be emulating in my own plans today. So again, Clancy Ross, this is 1945. This is before his competition. And this is what they would call a definition routine, or sometimes they call it a reducing routine. It's basically a weight loss routine. Now, bearing in mind, this is the bit of grace I will give Clancy at this point in time, is that they were using these routines to get into condition for the show. So I understand that this is not, the purpose of this is not hypertrophy. Okay. So we need to understand that they weren't doing a lot of cardio. They didn't have sort of other methods they were using for conditioning. They were kind of using their gym routines for conditioning. So from that standpoint, okay, we can, cut them a bit of slack, but I'll just present the routine to you guys and then I'll let you guys judge. So actually, there's one thing I think he did very well. So what he does say is routine was the same exercises as his, I'm going to call it a hypertrophy routine. It was just his normal routine. Yeah. So he hasn't gone in and suddenly changed up all of his exercises. He's kept the exercises the same. He's changed the format, which I'll talk about in a moment. But the exercises we have, and again, this is, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, or 3 times a week, was a standing overhead barbell press, a barbell curl, a barbell upright row, a barbell bench, an incline bench, a deadlift, a squat, a leg press, and then a calf raise. So a lot of multi-joint exercises here. And I will mention that there was a bit of I don't want to say contention, but there was some, competing beliefs here as to, do you do more multi-joints or do you do more single joint exercises leading up to comp? And there were certainly some bodybuilders like Reg who did kind of push a little bit more towards more single joint exercises, but this is the way Clancy was doing it. And he was doing 3 sets of, here's a bit, of 15 to 20 repetitions for each of these exercises. And he also shortened his rest periods between these sets compared to what he was normally doing. So short rest periods, 15 to 20 repetitions, multi-joint, big exercises, big lifts. And he did this, I think he did this for about a month, I will just say. So this isn't something he was doing for, 6 months or a year or whatever. It was just in those sort of few weeks leading up to the comp. Chris, what have you got to make of that?
Well, I think obviously the point that you led with is the most important one to emphasize, which is that he's keeping the same exercises in his program when he's going from his standard routine to his, pre-competition routine. And that's so important because what we're saying there is that he's ensuring that any gains that he's achieved in the off-season are hopefully going to be carried over, or not necessarily off-season because he's literally describing like just a few weeks before the competition, but, all of the gains he's achieved up to that point in the kind of competition preparation phase, he's now got to the level where he's going to probably not gain any more muscle mass. He's just going to try and keep as much as he's got. And he's at least ensuring that there is that correspondence between the fibers that are being activated previously to the fibers that are being activated in that last couple of weeks. Switching exercise is the worst thing you can possibly do, I think, really, in that kind of situation, because you're basically not going to gain anything new from the fibers that you might be training that are different, because you're probably not going to access much of them. And we're going to talk about some of the variables that go into that in terms of not just in terms of activating and loading, but you may not be able to stimulate the hypertrophy anyway, even if you are activating and loading, but we'll get onto that later on. But yeah, obviously, potentially, that any discrepancy between the exercises before and after starting the diet probably not going to be is not going to be a very good idea. All the other stuff that I could say probably said before when we talked about this exact same routine. I don't see a lot of, kind of back exercises in there. I'm obviously pleased to see the deadlift in there, which is something that we don't see, which I just can't get my head around it. It's like, why would you not pick a barbell up off the ground? It's the easiest possible exercise you can do with a barbell. So why isn't it in the programs of most of these silver era lifters? My brain is now in golden era mode, but why isn't it in the routines? So, but yeah, comments on the exact exercise is probably already done. But yeah, I think the important thing is that we're seeing that continuity between the pre-diet and post-diet exercise selection. Obviously, I'm in the same on the same page as you as regards the sets, reps, that kind of thing. I don't see any value in shifting to higher reps, for that phase. It makes no real sense at all from a fatigue point of view, whether it's intra-workout or post-workout, really.
If he were able to recover from this, most of that, I'm looking at it and, most of it would have been more or less recoverable. Maybe you could say chest, he's hitting it with a barbell, a flat bench and an incline bench as well. So, might run into some issues there. But if that weren't an issue, those high repetition sets, at least that first set should be stimulating as much as possible in the sense of maintaining what he's built, right? So he's not losing a whole lot by doing the high repetitions because he's still kind of getting that first set stimulus anyway. It's just not really giving him anything extra, yeah?
Well, I think the issue is the recoverability side, and we'll touch on that when we move into the physiology part of today's podcast. But you're right, assuming that he is recovering from one workout to the next, which I think is a pretty big assumption. If that's the case, then yeah, at sort of 15 rep maxes, you're getting close to a similar level of recruitment that you would do with a kind of a moderate load, 8 to 10 maybe. It's not going to be massively, massively different. So yeah, in terms of the stimulus. So if you're assuming that there's no hypertrophy possible really in that final few weeks, which is probably a fair assumption actually, then the reality is that if recovery is happening, there's probably not too much to worry about in terms of the program. There are absolutely worse programs out there, I give you that. But I think the assumption that he's able to recover from that type of workout with that rep range in that caloric restricted state, I think is a little bit of a stretch.
Yeah, that would be the variable. And I don't know how hard he would have been dieting, but I guess what I find interesting while I look at this and I think, oh man, this is not a plan I would like to do or that, I would give clients, given the parameters that he was sort of following here of, trying to hopefully maintain as much muscle as possible that he built and not, let's say, obviously everyone had access to cardio. You could just go outside, yeah. But, let's say that for whatever reason that was not actually on the table because I just weren't thinking about it. If he was using this workout to burn as much energy as possible for the purpose of fat loss and to try to maintain as much as he had, ultimately this is kind of something I guess you would maybe lean towards. Like, again, I'm not trying to justify it, but if you're pushing, like if this were recoverable, okay, this is achieving the best of both worlds, but not doing either one well. You know what I mean? So it's like, okay, with
I know what
you're
saying.
thinking, yeah. I can kind of see what logic led him to this point.
Yeah. I mean, ultimately, you would immediately make your life 10 times easier by doing a single set of moderate loads, kind of 8 to 10 reps, and then going for a long walk.
and then going, exactly. But if that just wasn't on the table, okay, I can see why they were maybe trying to burn energy in the gym, but
just take a bottle of water, go for a nice long walk, and enjoy the nice weather. And
so hopefully we'll talk about some potentially maybe more productive ways of achieving fat loss, or at least things to be aware of.
But just to kind of before we move on, just like coming back to this routine, yes, we can be very critical about it, but you're right. Fundamentally, we're still talking about a routine which is, full body 3 times a week with, sort of up to 3 sets per exercise. And, okay, I'm being critical about the recoverability, but on paper, it's not horribly outside the zone of recoverable. Recoverable is kind of 3 sets of moderate loads, which is up to 15 rep max. And he's just above that. You could equally say the same about somebody who's doing 4 sets of maybe heavier loads, sort of bottom end of the moderately heavy load, like 6, 7. If they're doing 4 sets of maybe 6, 7 rep max, that's probably the same territory as doing 3 sets of, 15 to 20. So the reality is it's not horrible. You're right. It's not horrible. And it is still better than 90% of what we see in the bodybuilding, kind of mainstream part of the bodybuilding community today. So, yes, we're being critical about it, but we're being critical from a very exacting position.
Yeah.
It's not horrible. I don't want people to run away with the idea that I'm being, saying that this is, even though it's a silver era program, it's not going to work. It isn't horrible. It's still better than most of what we're going to see today.
Yeah. And the exercise selection, like you said, we don't have chin ups. The deadlift, maybe you could have done a slightly better hip hinge, but I guess triceps long head's not going to get much work in what he's got there. But apart from that, it's a fairly decent exercise selection. He's just using a barbell. There's certainly a lot more he could do worse here. I feel like he's just trying to achieve too much with one tool. He's just not using other tools.
Yeah, sure. And again, we don't know why that might have been the case. I mean, there may have been practical considerations. It's like, but yeah, I didn't want to finish talking about that part of today's podcast without emphasizing that, any criticisms I have are being made from a position of extreme, kind of a very exacting mindset. They're not being made from a kind of looking at this in the spectrum of all the possibilities that I see out there. It's absolutely up in the top 10% of what's out there. I mean, it really
gosh. I mean, goodness, the fat loss programs I was taught to do as a PT, and I'm not even talking about Men's Health magazine type ones of bodybuilding.com. I'm talking about have been passed down to me by world-known leading coaches. And those fat loss programs are horrendous compared to something like this. So
It's quite amazing when you kind of get exposed to some of the really crazy stuff. Because I made the error of asking my co-host on the other podcast that I do, High Performance Physiology. I asked Rob to start sending me, all the silly things that he sees, specifically related to the topics that we were going to kind of talk about. So I said to him, send me some silly stuff that you see regarding, whatever it might be, eccentric training or, kind of vertical jumping or what have you. And my goodness, there's some absolute insanity out there, and people are making all kinds of weird stuff up. I think this is the reason why people, they kind of arrive on my social media and they start asking me these questions. And I'm like, no, that's not how this works. It works like this. And they're like, oh yes, but these people said it works like that. And I'm like, I'm sorry that you, that you were listening to them, but that's just absolutely not how it works. And I think we're kind of in this strange place where people kind of, they look at your numbers on social media and go, oh, well, this person had 3 million followers and you've only got 150,000, therefore they're more likely to be correct. I'm like, if you think like that, you're going to get yourself into all kinds of trouble. That's just not how it works. But, anyway, that could be an entire discussion in and of itself, but let's carry on.
Well, you know what, I don't want to make one comment on that, on what you just said, Rob sending you some stuff that people are doing poorly, and I'll expand this briefly on kind of what we were taught to do. And this is stuff, because I would say if I look at the fat loss programs we were taught, there was one that was like okay, and that would be German body composition. I don't know if you've been exposed to German body composition training. I don't know, like this came largely out of Charles Poliquin. I'm sure there was maybe people before Charles who were using it. I'm not sure. But what I liked about it was for fat loss, is it was full body. Now, and it would use like, you would sort of pair exercise. You'd pair an upper body exercise with lower body exercise. Idea with blood shunting. It would increase energy expenditure supposedly. But so I look at that. I'm like, oh, full body. Okay, that's good, because a lot of the time, a lot of the programs I was seeing in contemporary times are not full body, but they would do like 5 sets. And so, I'm looking at like actually plans that are being talked about or used in modern times. And the one bit they got well is a bit that people like Clancy got well. And then the bit that Clancy got, I guess, maybe, was questionable, was still better than what I'm seeing done today. We were doing 5 sets of 15, 20 repetitions, same as what Clancy was doing. So yeah, all in all, actually, this was probably not that bad compared to a lot of what we would be exposed to today.
Incidentally, I was just laughing as you were describing that, because incidentally, if you want to make yourself feel really, really miserable in the gym, then do a high rep upper body multi-joint lift, and then do a high rep lower body multi-joint lift, relatively, supersetted or relatively close together. And that is one of the most unpleasant experiences that you can do, I think, in the gym. It's
absolutely.
The metabolic demand is just off the charts. It's I'm not saying that it has any useful adaptions that result, but it's certainly a way to feel pretty horrible.
No, I vomited multiple times doing these workouts.
I can imagine. It's really, really, really nasty experience. I think I did it once and vowed never to do it again. It was yeah. It was definitely an experience. So anyway, yeah, there's some weird stuff out there, but ultimately, yeah, from my perspective, there's a lot of strange stuff out there. What we see in the silver era, even when it's bad, it's still good.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah. Okay, so where are we going now? What are we talking about?
So we just saw your program that you brought to us about pre-competition strength training routines. And what I'd like to talk about today is just a kind of an overview of what's going on during caloric restriction as regards muscle mass is concerned. Now, the reason I want to talk about this is because I think that from my perspective, which is kind of the sort of the muscle physiology perspective or the neuromuscular physiology perspective, when I look at the way that this topic is treated, it tends to be kind of driven from the nutrition point of view. People kind of come to, or nutrition and body composition point of view. So people come to the topic and they're thinking about systemic physiology, whole body physiology. They're not thinking so much about what's going on with the muscle itself. So what I want to do is kind of say, let me present an alternative way of thinking about this, or a complementary, not alternative, complementary way of thinking about this, which will help you or help the listener to just, bring in a lot more muscle physiology into their kind of thought processes when it comes to dieting. And really it's about muscle mass maintenance. It's not about fat loss particularly or at all. It's about muscle mass maintenance and how that is going on, or how that is being affected by the decisions that we're making. And I'll walk through and explain how it works. So basically what we can see in the literature is that we've got broadly two things to think about. We've got the effects of caloric restriction on our ability to, sort of create a workout stimulus. And obviously we've got what's going on outside of that workout situation. You can divide that into two kind of pieces. You've got the recovery process, but then you've also got the potential for, atrophy to happen. So we've got the same things to think about that we have in any strength training program. We're just going to say, well, how is caloric restriction affecting any of these three pieces? Now, straight away, when we think about workouts themselves, you can kind of go, well, am I less motivated because I'm hungry? Am I feeling lethargic and tired and all of those things? So you're going to kind of instinctively, expect there to be a reduction in motor unit recruitment because of the motivation reduction. So straight away, we're kind of aware of that. But of course, there's ways of mitigating that. You can kind of bring in, sort of a whole list of different things that will increase motivation, increase recruitment. So I think most people are aware of that problem instinctively, or just kind of, they've figured it out and they're kind of like, well, okay, we're going to need to take steps to address that. But it's interesting just to be aware that one of the factors that drives that low motivation is a reduction in, the stores of carbohydrate that we are holding. So muscle glycogen, blood glucose, those kind of things. As those drop, we obviously are going to experience that reduction in, or experience fatiguing sensations that contribute to our inability to hit maximum levels of recruitment. So it's not just about saying, oh, well, when I'm dieting, I feel tired. It's about, there are specific reasons, or at least one very good reason why we know that might happen. And of course, that then also kind of gives us a clue about what might be happening in the post-workout period, because of course, when you have low glycogen, you're going to get accelerated calcium-related fatigue, and that's going to then create problems for you in the post-workout recovery period. So kind of already starting to piece this together as a model. So essentially, we've just talked a little bit there about how, caloric restriction might affect our ability to perform in a workout. We've also got issues going on related to the, workout stimulus and the atrophy periods, and that really comes in the form of caloric restriction suppressing muscle protein synthesis rates. So this is a pretty well described phenomenon. A lot of the hypertrophy researchers have looked at this, and they've come back with answers broadly along the lines that a strength training stimulus can rescue muscle protein synthesis rates. So essentially you are coming to the workout from a period of rest, and you had a suppressed level of muscle protein synthesis compared to if you were not in caloric restriction, and then you do a strength training workout and it bumps you back up to your, and beyond your kind of original levels. So generally speaking, you can kind of see that strength training is doing something pretty useful to prevent that particular problem from happening. But of course, it's never going to get to levels that it would be if you weren't in that suppressed level, because it's not, kind of jumping you up to massive levels. It's kind of just moving you the same kind of level from baseline as it would have done in a calorie balance state. So, but we're also aware that reduced muscle protein synthesis is going to slow down recovery post-workout. So not only are we going to get a problem from the extra calcium-related fatigue caused by low glycogen levels, we're also going to get a slower rate of recovery from a muscle protein synthesis kind of point of view. So just pause there a moment and just kind of come back to the program that you brought to us today. And I made the comment that I don't necessarily think that in the context of a dieting situation, we would expect recoverable volumes to be, quite as high as they are in calorie balance. It's because of this reason. It's because we're getting lower muscle protein synthesis, and muscle protein synthesis is used to repair muscle damage. And also we've got more calcium-related fatigue for the same workout, because we're essentially, triggering an accelerated rate of excitation contraction coupling failure, especially in situations where we are in caloric restriction. So I think what that, for me, sort of starts to give us some ideas about structuring strength training workouts when we're in caloric restriction. I'm looking at the programs that I'm, kind of writing for people who are not in caloric restriction, and then I'm converting them into programs that are suitable for the dieting phase. And I'm expecting recoverabilities now to be lower. I'm expecting to have a problem with motor unit recruitment during the workout. So what can I do in the workout that's going to increase motor unit recruitment? What can I do, in the post-workout period or for the post-workout period to avoid, triggering so much muscle damage? And incidentally, reducing volume is a cool way of addressing both of those things. Because we talked before, one of my favorite stories for people is to kind of get them thinking about how their workout experience relates to physiology. I say to them, if you go in and do, if you're normally doing 3 sets of every exercise and you go in and do 3 sets, my favorite example is the seated hamstring curl. I know for a fact that if I go and do 3 sets of seated hamstring curls, I can kind of hit a certain set of numbers with a certain weight. If I only allow myself to do a single set, I will absolutely beat my first set number of the 3-set protocol by at least 1 rep. It's like, I know that's going to happen. And it's just because your brain knows that it's got more work to do. And so it creates a perception of effort associated with your future expectations. So if I'm now looking at that and I know that I've got a recoverability problem and I've also got a motor unit recruitment problem, I can actually address both those problems by dropping from 3 sets to 1.
So you mentioned the glycogen and that low muscle glycogen affecting muscle damage. Now, we talked a few weeks ago about carbohydrate rinsing and having some kind of like intra-workout carb. So someone might be listening and thinking, can I just do that? That's not going to influence muscle glycogen or blood glucose. So that's not a strategy someone could use, is it? So
the pre-workout carbohydrate mouth rinsing is going to but it's going to move you in a direction of addressing supraspinal CNS fatigue. So it's going to affect the motivation problem during the workout. I think carbohydrate mouth rinsing gets you halfway there because it starts to address the motor unit recruitment deficit that you might be experiencing, because it's just going to make you feel a bit better briefly while you do the workout. That's the layman's version of it. But it's not going to address the post-workout fatigue issue. There's some really nice data in actually cross-country running, in fact. They get, because it does actually produce a pretty decent amount of muscle damage in the lower body. They do quite an intense kind of maybe hour and a half run, and they come back, and generally speaking, they've got a neuromuscular fatigue component associated with calcium ion accumulation. It's the impact phases and the stretch-activated ion channels. If you give those athletes a carbohydrate drink before they run, they actually experience a lot less damage post-run. And it's because they're not in that kind of glycogen depleted state in any way, shape or form during the actual run itself. And in contrast, if you just give them water, they do experience that bigger damage response. So there's not much data in the strength training side of things, but since post-workout fatigue works the same way, irrespective of, the flavor of exercise that you're working with, it kind of gives us a pretty strong hint that, that pre-workout carbohydrate is actually a really interesting thing. Like from a nutritional point of view, again, this is the point I'm making when I say that I think that a lot of the discussions around dieting, body composition, and muscle mass retention during a diet and pre-competition for bodybuilding, a lot of it is driven from the nutritional body composition viewpoint. What I'm trying to do here is get people to go, okay, but how does this look from a muscle physiology point of view or neuromuscular physiology point of view? Because a lot of those guys will tell you, just make sure you get your post-workout, protein, and that'll, and I'm not denying that, and Matt will, mention that later on, although it's not as big an effect as people think. That absolutely does help. But pre-workout carb is actually going to give you something a little bit interesting that, is probably not usually discussed. And it's doing that by reducing the incidence of calcium ion-related fatigue. So in the cross-country example, how long before the event are they consuming the carbohydrates? I think it varies. I think it varies. That's something that I'm not I'm not knowledgeable enough about how systemic physiology works for absorption rates and that kind of thing. But, I would imagine that, if people want to give themselves the best possible, kind of chance of it getting full absorption, they're probably not going to want to swig it on the way to the gym. You might want to give it a bit of lead time to get it to the point where it's capable of contributing to, the internal processes. So honestly, I'd probably give it a couple of hours. I wouldn't want to risk leaving it till just before I walked in the gym. Whereas from a carbohydrate mouth rinsing point of view, you can, obviously.
So you would want to do both. You would want to have pre-workout carbs an hour, 2 hours before, and then you would want to have some intra-workout or before your lifts or closer to the actual exercise itself.
Yeah, bearing in mind that if you didn't want to ingest those as calories, you wouldn't have to, because it's not actually going to do anything for you at that point.
Now, you also mentioned reduction in MPS. Is there any influence on macronutrient ratio that would influence that? So if someone says, okay, I'm dieting now, I'm just going to push my protein up super, super high to mitigate that, is it just the simple fact of being in a deficit that's going to have that negative impact on MPS?
So this is an interesting one. The shape of this requires a little bit of context. So the shape of the literature that we've got at the moment as regards muscle mass retention, MPS, muscle protein breakdown, all that kind of stuff, the shape of the literature is currently a little bit messy. And the reason it's messy is because we see a very distinctive difference between when caloric restriction is perceived as a stressor and when it's not. And when you start to try and piece together the data that we've got in people, in animals, in various different models of research, they aren't always taking that into account. They're investigating caloric restriction, and they're not necessarily recognizing that there is a very big difference between when caloric restriction is perceived as a stressor and when it's not. And so you kind of get these different results. And when you're looking at this from a muscle physiology point of view, you instinctively will start to try and allocate studies to one of those two categories. And you'll be like, does this fit into that category or does it fit into the other category? So let me kind of just walk through that framework, and then I'll come back to the question about dietary protein. So essentially, when we look at the two scenarios, caloric restriction in a non-stress state. So if we say that the caloric restriction is not behaving as a stressor, in that scenario, what we see generally is just a suppression of muscle protein synthesis rates and not very much else. And as I say, you can rescue that with strength training. So now, just to be kind of 100% clear for people who are interested in being 100% clear, the reason I say that caloric restriction reduces muscle protein synthesis and as a result is going to produce atrophy compared to, calorie balance, is because we've got some really, really well-controlled human trials on this, both from an atrophy point of view and also from an MPS point of view. Now, when I say really controlled trials, I'm just going to flex a little bit because most of the time when I see hypertrophy and body comp researchers doing this, they're not controlling for the muscle physiology side of things. Let me give a good example of this. So imagine you've got either a group of people or a group of mice or rats, doesn't really matter in this particular situation, and you've got one contingent of them, one group of them, subgroup of them that are dieting and one group that's not. And essentially all you're doing is controlling for the amount of calories they consume, and you're saying, we're going to allow them to carry on doing their normal physical activity levels. And you think that you've now controlled physical activity. You haven't. Not from a muscle physiology point of view. You might have done from a body comp hypertrophy point of view if you're thinking systemically, but if you think on a muscle by muscle level, you're not. And the reason you're not is because if body weight changes, then the motor unit recruitment required to do the same physical activity changes. If I, just imagine, if I'm getting up and down out of a chair, that requires a certain level of recruitment, a certain level of effort to achieve. If I put a weighted vest on, it now requires more effort. If I take the weighted vest off, it requires less effort. So from a muscle point of view, different body weights massively impact on my ability to retain muscle mass with my normal physical activity. If I need 35-40% of my motor unit recruitment to walk up the stairs with one body weight, but then I lose some body weight and then now I only need 30%, my muscle mass is going to reduce accordingly because I'm not going to train the muscle fibers in that 10% gap. So we've got some really nice data in immobilization where you've got immobilized people and you essentially have calorie deficit groups and calorie balance groups. What you see is that muscle mass loss happens faster in the calorie deficit group than in the calorie balance group. And that is 100% controlled from a muscle point of view. Now, this is just a really good example of why I say that applying muscle physiology frameworks to the discussion of calorie restriction and atrophy and what happens in that phase is really useful, because it's telling you things that the current kind of nutritional body comp driven processes or frameworks are not telling you, because they're not thinking like that. So that's kind of like just a quick aside just to describe why I think, this is an important thing to kind of consider. Coming back to this idea of there being two different sort of states that we can be in. With calorie restriction, you've essentially got this, as I say, scenario where you're just getting a reduction in muscle protein synthesis. You can kind of then sort of distinguish that from things like sleep restriction, which we talked about recently, which is where you get a reduction in muscle protein synthesis as well as a muscle protein breakdown increase. Now, you can push caloric restriction to a point where it starts to behave like a stressor, and then it starts to look more like sleep restriction. And you start to get an elevation in muscle protein breakdown rates, and everything starts to behave a lot more aggressively. Now, what's interesting is there's a famous meta-analysis from 2022 where they showed that if you take calorie deficits beyond like 500 calories a day on average in strength training populations, then you start to experience muscle loss despite the fact that you're still doing a strength training program. Now, we can argue around the edges about whether those strength training programs are keeping people in a kind of stimulus phase, the whole time. Almost certainly not. So maybe the number is slightly bigger if you're doing full body every other day with exactly the same exercises. But the point is that you do start to see this muscle protein breakdown increase at the same time as a muscle protein synthesis suppression. And that even if your workouts are, kind of rescuing that, they're probably not rescuing it as effectively as they were with a smaller deficit or a less stressful experience. And at the same time, your muscle protein breakdown rates are increasing, which you probably aren't defending against. So I think there's this kind of shift as we go from caloric restriction, which is in a non-stress state, and caloric restriction, which is in a stress state, and it actually completely changes what's possible. So a lot of people will say to me, can I gain muscle in a deficit? And I'm like, yes, but with caveats. If you start to experience that as a stressor, then no, it won't, because I think what will happen is that the suppression of muscle protein synthesis rates will increase, and the increase in muscle protein breakdown rates will get out of hand, and your balance over the week will end up being net atrophy instead of net hypertrophy, even though you're doing everything right on the strength training side of things. And this then brings me back to your original question, which is, okay, so what does, kind of dietary protein do? Well, as I said before, dietary protein is going to help you, as the nutritionists correctly point out, recover in the post-workout period, because it will increase muscle protein synthesis that contributes to both repair and hypertrophy. But what's interesting is that in dieting situations, we start to see that the beneficial effects of dietary protein start to reduce. So if you're in a state of caloric restriction, then that bump in muscle protein synthesis post-workout that you're expecting to get from consuming your protein starts to get smaller. And it's really interesting to kind of, and this is the reason I gave that background about there being two different types of caloric restriction, one that's a stressor and one that's not, and there's probably a grey area between the two, is because I'm not sure from the minimal amount of data we've got at the moment whether that suppression of dietary protein's effect on muscle protein synthesis happens in situations that are irrespective of whether it's a stressor or whether it's only when it's a stressor. But it definitely happens when if we assume that a stressor is always going to be the worst of the two. I think, any scenario where we're pushing caloric restriction into stress territory, we would expect it to start to behave, in a state where, more dietary protein probably isn't helping very much. So, what's really interesting is that I think, nobody really wants to be in that state. So at some point, somebody's going to have to go away and see whether dietary protein effects on muscle protein synthesis are suppressed at low calorie restricted levels, or whether they're only expressed, that phenomenon is only observed in more severe calorie deficits or sustained severe calorie deficits. Obviously, it's probably just going to be a sliding scale, but at the end of the day, it is happening and it is a thing. So just in general, I don't really like to comment too much on the nutrition stuff, but I think there is definitely an argument to say when people are looking at their macros for a period of dieting, I would definitely look not just at protein and go, I think there's this tendency people just go, if I throw enough protein at the problem, then I'll be okay, and it'll somehow protect them from muscle loss. It won't if your calorie deficit gets too big. It absolutely won't. I'm absolutely confident about that.
Is the duration the MPS is elevated for with the protein, is that reduced as well, or is it just that spike that's reduced?
To my knowledge, there's no time point data. We're just dealing with just like very, very basic observations at the moment. So there's no
I don't really know
shape curve or anything like that.
I'm like, how would someone rationalize that more protein once you've kind of like maxed out what's going to be providing that MPS spike anyway? Why would more protein even be beneficial? I'm not even sure what that argument would actually be relying on.
We'd obviously need to get somebody who's more versed in that literature to comment on that. But my understanding is that there is a belief that it impedes the atrophy effect, or it impedes the breakdown effect. And I don't think that's what's reflected in the data that I'm looking at. What I'm looking at is that the stress response, the glucocorticoid response, has an oxidative stress, has multiple pathways that produce oxidative stress, which then start to create atrophy, and they are largely kind of going to do that independently of what you're eating, and in fact independently of what you're exercising as well. I think the way to think about it is that when your caloric restriction is not behaving like a stressor, then essentially you've got a lot of flexibility over what you can do. Your nutritional interventions will have an impact, your strength training will have an impact, and you can kind of manage the process from a positive point of view. It's like, yes, you're dealing with an MPS reduction due to the caloric restriction. That's totally true, but you can still work with that. I think when you start to push caloric restriction to a higher level, now just pause for a moment to comment on numbers. I can absolutely guarantee that both you and I are now going to get people demanding to know the exact number of calorie, the exact quantity of calorie deficit they should use in order to avoid muscle loss. And they'll keep asking that no matter how many times I say that's not possible. The physiological answer is that if you are perceiving it as a stressor, then it will be a stressor. So if the number is lower, then it's lower. If the number is higher, it's higher. Now, I've said before in other places that I know roughly what my numbers are for a stress response to be created, and they're a lot lower than 500 a day. I think they're more like 200 or 300 a day. And that's because I'm old and like my brain is always doing stuff. So I kind of have that issue there. But ultimately, and other people's maybe higher. This is the point is not the number. The point is, are you experiencing it as a stressor? If you're experiencing it as a stressor, then you're going to get a glucocorticoid response. It's going to create oxidative stress, which is going to produce this muscle protein breakdown acceleration. And as a result, you're going to lose muscle mass irrespective of what else you're doing right. It's just like you've got to think about these things as like two totally separate frameworks. Yes, there's a grey area in the middle, but fundamentally this is two separate frameworks. If we can manage it from a non-stress point of view, then it's totally manageable and things will have an effect. As you start to drift higher into the calorie deficit sort of area and it becomes a stressor, then you have problems. Now, the interesting thing is, of course, that anabolics make this entire argument go away. Because ultimately, being a glucocorticoid response, it is essentially, the exact polar opposite of the anabolic response. Glucocorticoid and anabolics are literally polar opposites to each other. So if somebody is using anabolics as part of their pre-competition preparation, everything I've just said is completely irrelevant because it's just not going to happen. you're going to get a permanent increase, not permanent, but you're going to get a constant increase in MPS, and you're not going to have the muscle protein breakdown issue that you get with the glucocorticoids, because they're just not going to be there.
It's the same thing we mentioned when we were talking about sleep restriction a few weeks ago, and you made that comment there as well about anabolics. And I think in that episode we made a comment about doing caloric restriction alongside poor sleep would be a bad idea. And this is explaining why that would be
exactly
a recipe.
Yeah, you're just creating two drivers of the same problem, and you're just summing them together. But again, somebody who is kind of using anabolics is going to listen to this and go, "That's not my experience at all." I'm like, no, It won't be.
Yeah,
it absolutely won't be. You could have horrible sleep, and you could eat, you could have a huge caloric deficit, and the anabolic would completely obliterate all of those negative effects. And that's what we see. That's what bodybuilders are, I think, able to get away with in those scenarios where they are using those compounds.
And I don't know if you are able to comment on this or not, but presumably we would at least see some of that mitigation, even just with like TRT, for example. It doesn't have to necessarily be super high doses of anabolics that would have effect as far as reducing muscle protein breakdown.
So yeah, I mean, this is tricky because a lot of the time, most of the anabolic steroid research is done in animals models, because obviously it's easier to get through ethics. So you kind of like, it's really hard to transpose dosages to humans in those scenarios. You can't really go, oh well, this is the dosage in a rat, therefore that's going to be the equivalent. You can't really do that. That's so you get a directional effect. I say this all the time in physiology. Physiology research gives you really good, clear, directional information. If you start going in this direction, you're going to get these kind of effects. Yeah. It gives you horribly poor quantitative information of like, well, at this point you will get this effect, and at this point you'll get this size of effect. It doesn't really give you that kind of data. Having said that, I think that there is a tendency in the industry for people to say that TRT is not the same thing as anabolic steroid usage, when it is. I think there's a lot of people out there who go, oh, well, TRT is just replacing your previous levels of testosterone. Not really. There is a definite indication on the hypertrophy side. You can see hypertrophy happening even in the few studies that have been done. You can see hypertrophy happening even in young people at what are essentially fairly common TRT dosages. It depends on who you talk to and what the clinic is that prescribes, but in the boundary of in the ranges that you see people being prescribed those, kind of dosages, in that zone, you are getting hypertrophy in young people when those young people are given those dosages in an experimental context. Similarly, if you look at side effects, and we've been talking about this a lot recently offline, but, if you look at side effects, you get side effects that are pretty noticeable even in TRT dosages. So one of my favorite sources of data for this is tendons and ligaments. You get tendon rupture and ligament risk increases even on TRT dosages. So, that's just, go and look at the studies. I've actually just pulled them all up and done a kind of analysis of them. And you do see that happening. So, and that's because of the anabolic effects that testosterone has or anabolics have in tendons, and that actually, interestingly, has a more negative than positive effect, because the tendon isn't gaining strength from size, it's gaining strength from structure. So this is one of the things that people miss about tendons. They go, oh, well, tendons are a bit like muscle. The muscle gets bigger, it gets stronger. The tendon gets bigger, it gets stronger. No, tendon doesn't get bigger and stronger. The tendon gets stronger when it gets restructured. And the restructuring process starts with collagen degradation. So if your anabolic comes along and starts basically doing the whole kind of, we can't have a degradation happening, breakdown is not going to happen. The poor tendon's sitting there going, well, how are you expecting me to get stronger if I can't restructure? Because you can't let me break down the stuff that was, kind of weak previously. I need to rebuild this in the way that's more, kind of resistant, stiffer, or whatever it is that you're trying to do. So the tendon doesn't actually adapt properly in those scenarios, And you see that effect even at very, very low dosages of anabolic steroid kind of. So I think really there is a tendency as a whole in the industry for people to go, oh, no. TRT is not the same thing as what bodybuilders are doing with, larger, what we call recreational dosages. I think broadly speaking, again, it's directionally the same. It's just you're going to get a much smaller effect than you get with the kind of recreational dosages that bodybuilders are using.
So you've mentioned a few times now that sort of transition point with a deficit is when it's perceived as a stressor. Now, there's not an easy way to identify when it is or isn't a stressor. I guess we could look at perception. Is that going to be more or less something someone can rely on?
Yeah. Not wanting to push too far into psychology territory, but yeah, I think ultimately, there's an interesting, I think it really depends on how in touch people are with how they feel. That sounds really strange because it's like, how can I not be in touch with how I feel? But I think there are people who just kind of maybe out of habit, just out of, the way that they've run their lives for however long, they don't necessarily check in on themselves. There's this kind of tendency in psychology research to talk about, not psychology research, sorry, psychology kind of as a mainstream phenomenon. They talk about checking in on yourself, like, how am I feeling right now? How would I actually experience what's going on around me? I think there's a lot of people who just go through life and don't check in on themselves. They're like, how am I feeling? Do I feel hungry? Do I feel sad? Do I feel happy? All those things. And I think if people are not doing that, then they are going to have a gap between their ability to notice when they are sort of experiencing stress or when they're not. People who are in the habit of checking in on themselves probably have a better sort of way of assessing whether or not they're experiencing something as a stressor. As I said before, we were joking about it before we came on the podcast. I absolutely know immediately if I push my caloric restriction into stress territory, my mood changes instantaneously. I note it, and straight away it becomes something that I can really kind of, act to fix the problem. I think there are a lot of people who just kind of maybe don't realize that they're just feeling miserable, and don't necessarily put two and two together. So I think it's one of those things where the process might be more about learning to observe yourself rather than about, wanting external metrics to tell you whether you're in a stress state or not.
When it comes to workouts, there's been a lot of discussion online about, what's the optimal training routine. I'm not talking for fat loss. I'm just talking in terms of a standard hypertrophy routine. And there's sort of two competing thoughts. And I know we've touched on this in a past episode where some people say, look, if we look at, biomechanics and we look at muscle physiology, this is the way we would want to structure a workout. And then other people come out and say, well, I find that boring or I don't find it enjoyable and therefore it's not going to be optimal for me and I want to do what I find fun. And obviously there's a line there and we've explored that conversation in the past, but it sounds like that's actually relevant when it comes to this, when it comes to dieting. And in fact, you could have two people who would perceive a particular method of dieting completely differently. And I know I've had clients where I generally will get clients to log. I'll get them to use something like MyFitnessPal or some similar app. And some clients find that having some control over that is actually something that gives them a lot of comfort and they enjoy that process. And I've got other clients where their thought of logging is it just hangs over them that I'm sure that would be a significant stressor in their life. And for them, it would be better to have some kind of lifestyle modification where it's like maybe we do some kind of intermittent fast or maybe we just do food, substitutes or swaps or whatever it might be to still get that person in a caloric deficit without adding that perception of stress to it as well. And just to expand on that a bit further, I know there's a tendency as well for people to do things like, and maybe a little bit less so now, but certainly in the past to have like, workout day nutrition, rest day nutrition, and, maybe one day would be high carb, one day would be lower carb, or, high calorie, lower calorie, whatever it was. I did that for many years with clients and got to a point where I found, it's for most people, this is just adding stress to how they're viewing their weekly diet. They need to be thinking about they can't eat similar things each day. You know, they need to have two totally different diet outlines. You know, they can't meal prep easily. Like, it just makes that process so much more difficult than it needs to be for a lot of people. So perhaps this could be actually one of the more important pieces to this conversation is, how do you achieve a caloric deficit for yourself that actually is less burdensome or less stressful for you to actually follow through on?
Totally. I mean, I think ultimately, if people want to push the caloric deficit to the maximum level that they can get to without it becoming a stressor, they've got to take all the other stressors out. You know, because ultimately we are working with the general adaptation syndrome here. This is talking about stressors, and stressors are cumulative. You know, so, you know, this is not talking about post-workout fatigue in the kind of old general adaptation syndrome model. This is actually talking about the general adaptation syndrome. So anything that is stressful is going to be a negative. So if you can find one dieting model that is less stressful than another, then that's a win straight away. So I think that probably has to be the guiding principle behind any, you know, kind of diet plan, which is like, how are you making this as stress-free as possible? The only modifications I would add would be that you'd, if you can, take a carbohydrate supplement a couple of hours before your workout. That's a good thing. And if you can, take some protein immediately post-workout. That's also a good thing. Don't worry about carbs post-workout, because you can't replenish them anyway in a muscle-damaged state. This is the biggest myth that's come across from aerobic exercise. All the aerobic exercise guys are like, you know, chugging carbohydrates post-workout and going, oh, this gets me ready for the next workout. Yeah, sure, because you didn't create any muscle damage. You know, try that with muscle damage in place and watch what happens. Absolutely nothing. So you want your carbs pre-workout, you want your protein post-workout. But other than that, I would say, you know, largely speaking, minimizing stress is going to be the better factor than anything else you can possibly do if you want to push that caloric deficit, you know, a little bit higher. You know, but again, in terms of modification of strength training routines, I think with whether you're in a caloric deficit that is non-stressful or stressful, it doesn't matter. Your recovery rates are still worse. So whatever you were doing before, you need to dial that back a notch, you know. So if it was 3 sets per muscle group per workout, pull it back to 1 or 2, you know. But again, hopefully people aren't using like silly frequencies or anything like that. So they shouldn't need to modify anything other than workout volume.
So would you say, like, obviously if you look at beginners, you know, recomposition is quite easy to achieve. You've got somebody who's never trained before, they can lose body fat and gain muscle, and it's not normally going to be that difficult to achieve. If you've got someone who's more advanced, is it reasonable to expect an advanced natural lifter to be able to gain muscle while dieting, or is that a somewhat unrealistic expectation?
I think it's very difficult to say at the moment based on the literature, and I think you would probably find that any gains would be so tiny as to be unmeasurable. So I'm not expecting that to be answerable in, you know, my lifetime. I don't think there's any reason. I mean, like, a lot of people get very confused about the difference between muscle physiology and systemic physiology. And they start kind of quoting laws of thermodynamics at you. And I'm like, muscles don't care about that. It's literally irrelevant. You know, it's like, you know, did they get a mechanical tension stimulus, and do they have the available protein to, you know, kind of act on that? If so, it's going to grow. But if you have caloric restriction in place, you're going to suppress MPS, and it's going to stop you from doing that quite as effectively. So from a physiological point of view, there's nothing stopping you from doing that, except you're going to find that, of course, your sort of rate of increase can be a lot slower than it would be if you were not in that calorie restricted state. Of course, if you push into the point where you've got the, you know, stress response starting to kick off, then of course it's not going to happen. In fact, it's going to go the opposite direction.
It sounds like frequency would be more important in someone who's dieting.
Well, yes, of course, because you've got that suppressed MPS, so your atrophy periods are going to be more pronounced, and your stimulus periods are going to be less effective. So if you lose any stimulus period that you could be getting, then of course you're going to be a worse state than you were before. So yeah, I mean, full body every day is always going to be the best on paper. Full body 3 times a week is probably a pretty decent compromise. Honestly, at this point, anybody who's using upper lower splits, I don't really have any time for.
I think you meant to say full body every other day. I think you said full body every day, but we did do a podcast
full body
a long
every
time
other
ago
day,
where we did talk about the possibility of someone doing full body every day. And we were talking about, obviously keeping reps in reserve, doing single set, lower repetitions, being careful about or mindful of, more lengthened muscle positions. And, it's interesting having this conversation. It makes me wonder, could that potentially be a feasible option if someone were able to recover from that? Maybe that could be an interesting approach.
Yeah, and of course you would just have to push that that sort of those concerns regarding recoverability. You'd have to push those even harder in a diet. So, if somebody wanted to do, kind of full body every day, because they were like, well, can we really mitigate the loss in muscle mass by providing a small stimulus every single day? I think you would really have to be super careful about what you were doing. I mean, I would be leaving probably 2 reps in reserve, like doing 3 or 4 reps and just leaving 2 reps in reserve, something like that. I'd be, and again, because you have to remember recoverability in terms of so coming back to this idea that, glucocorticoid and anabolic hormones are kind of opposite to each other. You've got the same issues across the whole board, not just about muscle tissue. So I would expect people to get more creakiness, more kind of joint discomfort and stuff in a diet compared to when they're not in a diet. So again, I would be super careful about everything. So I'd want to make sure that I would just say, don't do this with free weights. For example, I would be like, don't do this with free weights. If you're going to do an everyday workout plan in a diet, don't do free weights. Find machines that feel really super comfortable for you, and even limit ranges of motion if you have to avoid any discomfort whatsoever. And I'd go very, very extreme in terms of protective of the kind of the movement patterns and the stability and all of those things to avoid any kind of discomfort. Even then, like there'd be some situations where I'd still be cautious. Like, for example, one of the share a personal example. One of the things that catches me out is the seated leg curl, because I'm not a big guy, but I've got pretty strong hamstrings, so I can move a pretty decent amount of weight on a seated leg curl. But what tends to happen is it pulls my lower back right away from the pad. So I'm pulling, and it just absolutely pulls me around. And I can be absolutely pushing myself as hard as I possibly can into the seat, and my legs are still moving me around because of that, kind of discrepancy. So that has caught me out in a diet a couple of times where I've been dieting, and I've been going to the gym doing seated leg curl 3 times a week, because I tend to drop back into full body A lot. I do full body AB. I prefer it if I'm like trying to get things to, maximize, but I tend to drop back into full body A because I'm just like, well, it means that if I only get 2 workouts in, it doesn't matter, So I'm kind of doing seated leg curl 3 times a week, and that has given me sort of some discomfort, in dieting situations. It never does when I'm not in a diet, because I can just the kind of the repairability is there. Whereas if I start doing that in a dieting situation, I always tend to get grumbly lower back situation.
The seated leg curl is actually one of the exercises I've seen the highest number of clients have issues with, especially stronger clients. And from a lower back perspective, not just because obviously some people do notice that hamstrings do, take a little bit longer to recover from. That's a fairly common thing for people to observe. But in terms of getting injured or just tweaking the back, the lumbar, I do have certainly seen that in a seated leg curl quite a lot. And this is where, like for me personally, I use a seat belt if I'm going to use a seated leg curl, because it doesn't feel great on my back either. No. And if you're moving decent loads, it's pretty challenging
and
to
it
keep yourself in
position. It
position.
can be aggravating when you're doing it in a full body workout and you've just done some pressing, which for me is a triceps exercise. So I'm very triceps dominant. So I do any kind of pressing, and then I go and do a seated leg curl, and I just don't want to press into that. I'm like, no, this is not what I want to do right now. I'm kind of done with the pressing thing. Can we move on and do something else? And I'm like, well, I actually have to press in order to keep my stability in this exercise. So, it's like if I remember, then I'll be like, okay, so I do my presses, and then I have to remember, and I go, okay, so I do some quad work, and then do some pulling, and then whatever else, and then come back and do seated leg curl at the very end. Okay, now it's not quite so bad, and I can kind of, countenance the idea of using my triceps again. But it's just an example to put some kind of, real life picture or, color to this idea, which is that, I think that it's not just about muscle recovery, the potential for overuse injury or, discomfort or whatever, I think is also going to be higher. And it might be that it's, as I say, the motivation to stabilize myself is not there. It might be the repairability of other structures is not there. It might be a combination of all of those. But I think it's definitely a factor that I'd be aware of is, if you are going to go down that route of trying to go super high frequency, then, just try and take all the risk out of the program as you can is what I would do.
Now, when you talked about stress before, you sort of mentioned it's the cumulative total of all the stresses that we want to be conscious of. And we're not just talking dieting stress, are we? So obviously we've talked about sleep and, lack of sleep being a contributing factor there. But, this would even be psychological stresses that would be, related.
Well, all stress is psychological.
Yeah. Sure. But, I guess if
that's why it's a thing.
If people are experiencing stress in their, I guess in their work or in their home life, these are all things that are going to be contributing to that as well. Hey, so it might be the kind of thing where one might want to consider when would be the most appropriate time for them to actually do a dieting phase, or, are there other interventions that people could be using at that point as well? Obviously you've talked about checking in with oneself and actually seeing how they're feeling, but, there's certainly other interventions even if we look at stuff like earthing or grounding or meditation, all these things that have a positive effect around, cortisol levels. So there certainly could be other interventions or lifestyle interventions that people could be looking at including as well, couldn't there? Oh,
totally. I mean, interestingly, checking in is more about trying to get a handle on what your kind of numbers are. I'm not sure. I mean, yes, checking in, I think for some people can be a stress reliever, but the context in which I was introducing it was more about just trying to use your perceptions to gauge where you're at. And I think, if it has a stress relieving effect, great, but it's more about it's like a counter movement jump test before a workout. It just kind of gives you a feeling of where you're actually at. And I think a lot of people just don't know where they're at because they've never thought. It's like a literacy function really for, it's like emotional literacy really. It's like, where are you at? A lot of people just don't think to check in. It's strange because it's almost like just, doing basic maintenance on your car to check the oil and check the, kind of state of it. And is it capable of doing what you want it to do? Check the tires, check the pressure. Have you got enough water in the washer bottle? I mean, it's like, are you checking these things? And then you can do the same thing with your brain in terms of, the state of stress that you're in. But yeah, all those other tools that you can then implement are totally, kind of valid to help people manage and alleviate some of the stress they're experiencing. But yeah, I think the big stuff is like, don't try and do this when you've got a big project at work. Don't try and do this when you've got a relationship issue that you're managing. Don't try and do this when you've got family members that you're taking care of. Don't try and do this when you're and a lot of people will say, oh, no, you can handle all of that stuff. You can do it. And it's like, you can, but it would be a lot easier if you didn't have to. So why make your life difficult? Why not just organize this for another point in your calendar year or whenever, when it's going to work better for you? Yeah, it's funny because, given what you're saying there, it's like, well, actually the best time to diet would be on holiday or on vacation. It's like, oh, but that's when you want to be eating all these foods, so it's not going to help you with any deficit. So it is a bit of a balancing act, but it's definitely something worth being aware of that, what else is going on in life, and is that going to stand in the way, or is that going to exacerbate some of the downsides that dieting is going to be causing alongside it? So, even supplementation could have a role to play there as well. Like you said, these things are not going to,
necessarily, mitigate some of the downsides if there's all these other big factors going on. But these are things that people could certainly be looking at and including.
Totally. And I think there's, again, from my perspective, it's frustrating that a lot of the dominant narrative around dieting has come from the body recomposition, nutrition standpoint, and it ignores the muscle physiology standpoint as the primary driver. If we started looking at dieting as being primarily about muscle mass retention from a neuromuscular physiology point of view, I'm not saying that these approaches are not complementary. I think they are complementary, but I think at the moment we're losing a lot of information and usable practical knowledge that we could implement simply by ignoring this side of things. From a supplementation point of view, I think that if researchers start to take into consideration this kind of framework, then they would have a number of interesting avenues they could pursue, especially around the oxidative stress side of things, because the way in which glucocorticoids produce atrophy is we talked about this in the sleep module, podcast. Ultimately, we've got this issue whereby oxidative stress is being produced by the glucocorticoids through a number of pathways, and that is then driving the atrophy by elevating muscle protein breakdown. If you interfere with that oxidative stress, and there's been studies that have done this, they've gone in and they've tested a glucocorticoid, usually an exogenous one. They've produced an exogenous, they've implemented this regime of exogenous glucocorticoid. They've created an oxidative stress response. They've noted that. They've then produced a muscle protein breakdown response based on that oxidative stress. They've then gone in and applied an antioxidant, and it's broken the link. And it stopped the glucocorticoid, the exogenous glucocorticoid, from leading to that muscle protein breakdown that produces atrophy. So there are some really interesting interventions that are already being tested in certain contexts. But what's not happening is that the body recomp kind of sort of section of the literature is they're not looking at this stuff and realizing that that's doable. So they're not thinking in those terms. And that's it's the same thing that happens when you try to talk to hypertrophy researchers about what they call stretch-mediated hypertrophy. And you're like, hey guys, this is just sarcomerogenesis. And they run around screaming, waving their hands in the air. And you're like, come on guys, it's not that horrible. It's just physiology. Come on. And it's the same thing we've got here with, the body recomp is kind of going its own way. And there's some really interesting stuff being done physiologically around glucocorticoids and exogenous or endogenous, but they're looking at that stuff and showing how it works and how it produces atrophy. That is absolutely usable. It's just that they haven't quite made those connections yet. So I think it's really, really interesting. I'm not saying that I think that antioxidants are a good idea, because they have got downsides, but I think there's data there that could start lines of investigation for people who know more about that stuff than I do.
Now, I'm sure there's going to be people listening who are going to be thinking, okay, you've mentioned a large deficit could be more problematic potentially due to the stress response. Now, there's some people, and I would put myself in this camp as well, who do prefer to do shorter bouts of, or maybe even like intermittent dieting periods where they might do like a larger caloric deficit for either a few days at a time, or they might do it for a couple of weeks and just sort of reduce a total dieting period, as opposed to just a smaller deficit, a couple hundred calories for 12 weeks or whatever. Now, obviously, the main thing you've brought up there is, hey, this is probably going to become a stressor if it's a significant deficit. Is there anything else worth being aware of? Like, if we were to look at, this shorter duration of dieting at a larger deficit compared to, because in my mind, I'll tell you what's happening for me when I do this. I think to myself, okay, if I'm in a deficit and I know that there's this reduction in MPS and I know that I'm probably not going to be building significant amounts of muscle over this time, is it going to be better for me to draw this out over 12 weeks and potentially kind of not really get anywhere and just, do that dieting period? Or, okay, maybe there'll be this increase in muscle protein breakdown if I do this significant caloric deficit, but if I get it over and done with in a couple of weeks, I can now go back to actually building in only a few weeks' time. Do you have anything to sort of say to either side of that, or is it kind of going to be someone's individual preference?
I would say that it's going to depend on the steepness of the curve of how. So obviously, yeah, it's going to depend on the steepness of the curve of your glucocorticoid response, essentially. So if you're sort of short periods of time with large deficits produce a really big stress response, then atrophy is going to happen really quickly, and so you're going to go backwards really fast. If you've got a really steep curve on your glucocorticoid response, so it's hammering you down into really negative territory really, really quickly with just a smaller extra deficit. If you've got a really shallow curve, so you're getting a very small amount of extra glucocorticoid response for an extra couple of hundred calories a day, then you're in winning territory, aren't you? So it's really going to depend on how steep your curve is. So if you've got this really, really shallow stress response, so that you add a couple of extra 100 calories a day on a deficit and you only really produce a little bit more atrophy, that's a shallow curve. No big deal. You can manage that. If you've got a curve like that, which is how I suspect mine is, then you get this enormous stress response from just going a couple of extra 100 calories a day into a deficit. You feel absolutely horrific, and you know that you're probably hemorrhaging muscle mass at a rate that is not really sustainable. So I think it really depends on what your curve looks like, and only you can really experiment and play about with that and get a feel for what it looks like. And again, being stressors, there are going to be aspects to them that are things that you can adjust to. So, you know, for people who've been, say, intermittent fasting as a lifestyle choice for 3, 4, 5 years, I would not expect them to have the same kind of stress responses to a bit of fasting than somebody who's not. So again, and now everyone's going to run around going, oh, well, all I need to do is spam intermittent fasting. And I can, okay, yeah, but just bear in mind that it takes time to get through these adjustment phases. So if you're planning on doing a diet next year, maybe, well, we're in, December already. So
only got a few weeks to adjust to
it. Really great. But yeah, like if you're talking about, the sort of 6 to 12 months time, you're planning on doing a deficit and you're planning on doing a caloric restriction period and you want to use intermittent fasting, fine. You could spend a year getting used to that. And I'm not saying a year is the right number. I'm just pointing out that months and months and months are probably necessary to really kind of get to a point where it stops being a stressor. What I think is a risky choice is to be a person who's been eating 3 square meals a day since the year dot, and then say, oh, and for this diet, I'm going to use intermittent fasting. I'm like, that's not a good choice.
Yeah.
That's not a good choice. It may look like a good choice on paper to you. You may be attracted by the idea of it, but you're shocking yourself with 2 separate stressors.
Yeah.
The actual kind of timing of your meals, which you've become accustomed to, and the fact that you're still going to be eating less than your maintenance level of calories. That's 2 things that you didn't necessarily need. You could have had one thing and sort of got to the same point.
Yeah.
And I'm not bashing intermittent fasting. I'm just pointing out that it is going to require a little bit of adjustment.
No, I think that's such a good point. It's not I understand it's not like a sexy point to make that, hey, this is going to be dependent on the person. And for some people, this is going to be potentially better for them. Other people, this is going to be more suited. But ultimately, that is the way this is going to work. And, I would always present, if I'm dieting with a client, I'll present them 2 options. And I'll say, hey, we can either do it this way. We can either do, say, often what I'll do is multiple days a week. I might do it every second day at a very significant deficit, or say, 3 or 4 days a week at a very severe deficit, a few days of baseline. Or would you prefer just this smaller deficit, keep it the same, do that for a longer period of time? What are you going to find less burdensome? And,
and they might not know. They might actually not know.
No.
And they might have to experience both to know which one works better for them. That's the point that I'm making. It's like, everything that we can talk about around this topic, all of it comes back to the same point, which is that how are you feeling when you're doing it?
Yeah.
That's all it comes back to. It's like, and when I say how are you feeling, I mean how are you actually feeling. I don't mean how you think you're feeling.
This is the will yourself through it. We're not talking about either. Something like, oh, just toughen up.
Genuinely experience this, because that's the real. Because you can't lie to yourself about your stress levels. They are what they are. So you can kind of fake it till you make it, but ultimately that isn't how your body experiences stress. So you've kind of got to be able to communicate with yourself and know what it is that is happening. And you may have to try multiple different approaches to get to a point where the one that feels least objectionable to you is identifiable. And so all of the details on top of that are just marketing, really. It's like somebody wants to do it this way, somebody wants to do it that way. It's just like, well, what it comes back to is, how is the stress experienced by the person?
Yeah. It is definitely interesting how two different people are going to have a totally different experience to it. I mean, my favorite way by far to diet would be intermittent fast, and then I basically just bookend, or I'll have some calories before my workout, and I have, peri-workout carbs, and then I'll basically have everything else for dinner. Why are you laughing?
Yeah, I'm laughing because I'm just looking at you in, kind of the two totally different parts of the world that we're living in. I can look outside and there's snow on the ground and there's a grey sky, and all I can think about is getting a hot drink in my hand and maybe having some, warm to eat. Whereas, you're able to walk outside and there's probably blue sky and sunshine and a very nice ambient temperature, or a bit too hot. But, there's environmental factors that feed into these kind of experiences. But at the end of the day, as I just keep saying, it comes back to how the person is experiencing it. And yes, environmental factors are going to play a role. But at the end of the day, it really does just come back to how big is the stress that the person is experiencing. If you take away as much stress as you possibly can, you can push that deficit further.
Okay, I've got one more question on macronutrients. So there used to be this idea that someone could push up carbs when they're dieting, and especially push up carbs towards the end of the day, and that'll have a sort of, I guess, like blunting effect on cortisol, and that'll, this sort of like carb backloading would reduce stress from dieting, and that sort of made a bit of resurgence lately, not so much around the cortisol effect, but people sort of really pushing hard, hey, carbs is like the thing that matters. Is there anything to that in terms of pushing carbs up during dieting, having some kind of this mitigating effect on cortisol, or is that not really a thing?
I don't know. It's a question that I'm actually very interested in. I've mentioned to you before that I've collected a few animal model studies where I can see correlations, or at least visible relationships, between muscle glycogen running down to very low levels, and around those times you start to see cortisol jumping upwards. So, just in terms of association, that you could make a case for that. I don't feel comfortable at the moment making a strong case for it, and I haven't got to the point where I've got a model that I'm confident in, so I wouldn't want to commit. But I am in the process of collecting studies where I see them and starting to try and build a picture, because I do think there's something going on there that's interesting. Again, it just comes back to, does it help people individually? Personally, I tend to drift in that direction. I'm, definitely run hot on carbs. I don't tend to be able to function without them. But again, people are going to be different and have different, kind of experiences with it. So I think for now, I would just keep coming back to the point where it's like, try a bunch of different stuff, stick with it for a few days and just make notes, check in with yourself, figure out what it feels like, and then try something different and do the same thing again. And you'll figure out what works for you. When people come to me and they're like pitching an idea and they're like, this works because of these reasons, I'm like, I'm not really going to listen to you, because at the end of the day, there's too many variables in there for that to apply to every single person. What I'm more interested in is the person who comes to me and goes, well, I tried this and I tried this and I tried this for like a week at a time, and I experienced this when I did this, I experienced this when I did this, and I experienced this when I did this. You've figured out your own answer then, haven't you? You've got to a point where you now know that if you eat these things in these places, or you eat these, you structure your caloric deficit in this way, you know that works for you. At the moment, I'm much more likely to sort of accept the kind of experiences of the other person who's done the testing, because they've figured out what works. And the point here is that people say, well, why don't you do this for strength training? Because we're not talking about stressors when it comes to strength training. Like when people come to me and go, well, I like training with this exercise routine and that works for me, I'm like, I don't care, because we're not talking about stressors anymore. It's irrelevant. So when I'm talking about managing stress, it's about how you feel. When I'm talking about strength training, it's how strength training works. It's totally separate thing. So strength training doesn't play by the same rules as stress management, because one's about how you feel and one's not. So that's why we would say, for somebody who goes, oh, I tried 3 times a week full body and I didn't like it, therefore I'm not going to do it. I'm like, I don't care. It doesn't change the fact that 3 times a week is still better than whatever nonsense bro split you were doing before or like to do. That's not the same thing. That's not the same thing as trying to figure out how stressors are being experienced in your dieting phase, because stressor is the thing that's managing whether or not you're getting atrophy happening or not.
That seems like a really important point, and I hope people have understood it, but is there any more you can expand on that? Because they are 2 totally different things.
Exactly. What I'm saying is that when somebody comes to me and goes, oh, I tried, 10 different training programs and I hated training 3 times a week full body, but I really love training bro split once a week with each muscle group. I'm like, I don't care. Full body 3 times a week is still better than the nonsense bro split.
Because your enjoyment or your lack of enjoyment is not influencing
stimulus
period.
A marginal benefit. Yeah, it's a marginal benefit.
But the physiology of how the muscle works is all still the same, regardless of your perception of. Yeah.
Exactly. When you're talking about dieting, you're talking about managing the stressor, because if you push the stressor to the point where it tips you over into it being net atrophy, you can't really rescue that. So you could be doing on paper what somebody has told you is perfectly correct and ideal, and they could have given you a million physiological reasons why they're, some kind of super genius when it comes to body recomposition, and it still won't work for you, because if you're miserable, it doesn't work.
But because ultimately it's the psychological component is driving the physiological.
Correct. Because in this instance, psychology is driving the physiology. In strength training, psychology is having a marginal impact on physiology because it's affecting motivation. But there are other things you can do to become motivated. So again, it's like you can handle that problem to a greater extent. Here it's totally different. It's like, if you're miserable, I don't care how many PhDs have put together a program that's supposed to work for you, it doesn't work.
Yeah, I think that's a good point there, that from a hypertrophy standpoint, this psychology is influencing essentially that one component, like that motivation bit, and that's one of many things. Whereas when it's coming to dieting and stress, it's the one thing that's driving all of it.
And at the end of the day, that marginal change in motor unit creating that happens due to motivation, you still can't fix exercise selection problems. You can't, no matter how much you motivate yourself, you can't make a biceps curl train your calves. You can't, you can't make, trying to think of a slightly less silly example. You can't make the costal fibers of the pec work in shoulder flexion, they're shoulder extensors. So it's like, there's no amount of willing it to happen that's going to make it happen. Yeah,
I mean, ultimately what we're saying is what of the physiology we're looking at, what can psychology influence? And I guess that's really what we need to be asking, because when people are trying to make this argument that, I enjoy this or I don't enjoy that, it's like, okay, but what is that enjoyment factor able to influence? And like you said there, it's not able to influence, which muscle or part of a muscle is actually being, used in a particular exercise, how long that stimulus period is, or, whatever. It's not actually influencing any of those things. There's only one very minor part it's influencing. So
whereas
I
in
think
contrast,
that's maybe a helpful
caloric restriction, it can literally bomb you back past baseline.
Yeah, cool. Okay, I think that's a good place to end. Is there anything else you wanted to add before we finish up?
No, I think we're good.
Okay, cool. Well, it's that time of the year where people probably aren't thinking about dieting, but I'm sure they will be in about a month and a bit. So when you do start thinking about dieting, maybe come back and listen to this and start thinking about, what are some ways that you could diet in ways that you're going to perceive as being less stressful or just going to work better for you. And it might not be what, other people are saying works for them. It might actually involve a little bit of trial and error and seeing what's actually suited best to you. So thank you guys for joining us, and we hope you'll join us again next week for another episode.